The newsroom erupted in chaos. "GE just lost 100 billion in market value," someone shouted. Phones rang like alarm bells in a sinking ship. Analysts scrambled, anchors barked numbers no one could absorb. The ticker bled red. A corporate giant was crashing fast. Jack Welch's portrait stared silently from the boardroom wall. Once revered as a symbol of American capitalism, GE was now unraveling at the seams. Jeff Immelt sat frozen at his desk, the glare of monitors casting harsh light on his weary face. "How did it get this bad?" he whispered. No one had answers, only echoes of a legacy built on power and pride. In the control room of CNBC, screens flashed, "GJ shock collapse." Stockholders watched their fortunes disintegrate. Retirement dreams vanished. Pensions vaporized. Wall Street veterans stared in disbelief. "It's Enron all over again," one muttered. Outside GE's headquarters in Boston, employees smoked nervously in the cold morning air, eyes fixed on phones, jaws clenched in fear. GE's fall had begun, and no one was prepared for the storm. In 2001, Jeff Immelt inherited an empire, but not the one he expected. While America grieved 9/11, Immelt faced a financial firestorm. GE Capital, once the company's crown jewel, became a silent liability, bloated with risky debt. The shine of Jack Welch's legacy concealed cracks now widening fast. "Stay the course," Welch had said, but Immelt knew the landscape had changed. He wasn't a rock star CEO. He was a corporate firefighter with a leaking hose. The world was shifting, digital was rising, manufacturing costs ballooned, and Wall Street expected miracles every quarter. Immelt tried optimism, but behind the smiles were sleepless nights and internal wars. Executives whispered of missed targets, outdated strategy, and over-leveraged arms. "We need to simplify," Immelt insisted, but GE was too big to steer and too proud to pivot. As the years rolled on, each earnings call became a performance, each projection a prayer. The empire was still marching, but now no one was sure in which direction. Immelt's first year saw GE's stock stagnate, a sin in the gospel of growth. Investors doubted. The media circled. Jack Welch was everywhere, a ghost haunting every earnings call. Welch would have tripled this, critics sneered. Immelt, analytical and restrained, lacked Welch's swagger. The board smiled tightly, but trust cracked beneath the surface. Inside GE, fear bred politics. Managers hoarded wins and buried mistakes. Division heads spun numbers for Wall Street. "No surprises," was the directive, not truth. Immelt wanted change, but the machine resisted. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was culture, ego, tradition, all crashing against reality. Layoffs loomed. Innovation stalled. Financial engineers whispered behind closed doors. "We can hide this for a while," one muttered. But the truth was leaking, in missed projections, in desperate restructuring, in silence between sentences. GA had become too big to feel. And in that numbness, danger fermented. The year was 2008, and the global economy caught fire. Banks collapsed. Confidence evaporated. GE Capital, responsible for nearly half of GE's earnings, was now radioactive. "We're not a bank," Immelt insisted. But no one believed him. The lines between finance and industry blurred until no one could explain what GE truly was. Stockholders ran for the exits. Credit rating agencies circled like sharks. The mighty conglomerate, once immune to market shocks, was suddenly begging the Fed for help. Immelt secured emergency funding, a public humiliation. Warren Buffett stepped in with a lifeline, but even that smelled like desperation. "It's a crisis of trust," said one analyst. And it was. Inside GE, panic crept in. Some stayed silent. Others plotted exits. The press labeled G too complex to survive. The brand that once symbolized American strength now symbolized American fragility. The ground beneath GE was no longer solid. It was quicksand. In the aftermath, GE survived, but barely. The bailout bruised its image. Immelt called it resilience. Investors called it a fall from grace. The media called it a reckoning. Divisions were sold. Jobs were lost. Trust was shattered. GE, once the blueprint for success, had become a cautionary tale. But this was only the beginning. Beneath the surface, the numbers still didn't add up. Quarterly wins were manufactured, not earned. The culture hadn't shifted, it had fractured. Immelt was fighting ghosts, illusions, and a board that still clung to Welch's shadow. "We're transforming," he claimed, "but transformation without clarity is just noise." And GE was growing louder, more chaotic, more desperate to appear composed. A storm was brewing. And this time, there would be no Buffett, no bailout, only consequences. The Titan was losing its balance. What? And the ground was starting to crack again. Jeff Immelt stood before the mirror, tie half nodded, his reflection hollow. The office lights flickered behind him like ghosts. It wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about legacy. He was no longer fighting for Jeff's success. He was fighting to avoid its shame. "They think I failed," he whispered, but no one was listening. His father had worked for GE for 38 years. The same factory floor that had once smelled of oil and pride now smelled like dust and decay. Immelt wasn't trying to build anymore. He was trying to hold together something already broken. Behind closed doors, the board grew cold. There were no congratulations, only conditional support. His marriage strained. His sleep broken. Stress lived in his bones now, not just his shoulders. "Maybe I'm not Jack," he once told a confidant, "but maybe that's a good thing." Yet the doubt festered. On Wall Street, GE was still a symbol. But symbols can shatter too. And no one teaches a titan how to bleed gracefully. He walked through the GE research lab in silence. The innovation, once crackling with energy, now felt abandoned. Engineers avoided his eyes. Whiteboards were wiped clean. Projects suspended. The hum of machines was replaced by the hum of uncertainty. Uncertain. He stopped before a prototype, a sleek engine meant to revolutionize aviation. "We shelved it," said a young engineer, barely audible. "Not enough funding." Immelt nodded, but inside, his gut twisted. GE had always been the future. Now it was stuck in the past. Investment was drying up. Research was gutted. Ideas suffocated under quarterly pressures. "Can't we just build again?" he asked, but the silence answered. This wasn't just about spreadsheets, it was about soul. And GE had lost its. The lab had once symbolized American ingenuity. Now it was just another room with lights still on, but hope unplugged. As he left, he whispered, "We used to make things people believed in. Not anymore." At home, Immelt barely recognized himself. The mansion in Connecticut was beautiful but empty. He sat on the edge of his bed, tie still on, staring at the framed photo of his father in a GE uniform. His wife entered, placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're carrying too much," she said gently. He didn't answer. The weight of a global legacy, the pressure of a failing empire, it was all too much for one man. The world expected him to be steel. But he felt like glass. His daughter's laughter echoed faintly from another room, a sound both soothing and painful. He hadn't been present. He'd missed birthdays, school recitals, milestones, all sacrificed for a company now eating him alive. He rose, walked to the window, looked out at the trees swaying in the cold breeze. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to feel the sadness. The man saving G was losing everything else. During a town hall at J's manufacturing plant, Immelt took the stage. The air was heavy with tension. Workers stared, arms crossed, brows furrowed. These weren't numbers on a spreadsheet. They were fathers, mothers, families fearing for their future. "I know you've lost trust," Immelt said. "But I haven't lost belief in you." The silence was brutal. A man in the back stood. Why did you let it get this far? The room froze. Immelt exhaled slowly. We made mistakes, big ones, but this isn't over. The workers didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They listened, but the belief was fractured. Trust wasn't won in words. It was earned over time, and GE had spent years burning it. The town hall ended with polite nods and downcast eyes. Outside, the workers lit cigarettes in silence. A woman whispered, "I remember when this place felt like home. Now it just felt like waiting for bad news." That night, Immelt opened a yellowed manila folder marked Welch Legacy. Inside were letters, speeches, and a scribbled note. Leadership is visibility. He sat back, eyes closed. Welch had been everywhere, in offices, factories, headlines. Immelt had been buried in numbers. In an attempt to modernize, he'd lost the personal touch. G wasn't just a corporation, it was a myth. A myth built on charisma, confidence, and control. And now, all three were cracking. Immelt penned a letter to his team. "If we are to rebuild, we must reconnect," he wrote. Not just as a company, but as people. But doubt lingered as he stared at the page. Was it too late? Could a letter rebuild faith? Could leadership once forgotten be remembered through humility? Outside, a storm rolled in. Lightning illuminated his desk. He closed the folder, stood slowly, and whispered, "Tomorrow, I show up." Behind the curtain of earnings reports, G's internal war was heating up. Senior executives clashed behind glass walls, voices raised over spreadsheets and slide decks. Departments became silos, each guarding turf like wartime generals. "If we show weakness, we lose the street," snapped the CFO. "We've already lost the street," muttered a marketing lead. Immelt tried to mediate, but leadership fractures ran deep. The culture had turned defensive, paranoid. Loyalty was replaced with self-preservation. Performance reviews became battles, not evaluations. Bonuses shrank. Rumors spread. Even the boardroom wasn't safe. Several directors whispered of succession plans, discreetly courting outside candidates. Immelt noticed the shift in posture. Fewer direct stares, more polite nods. Trust was evaporating, and he could feel it. At the next investor meeting, a Goldman Sachs analyst raised her hand and asked bluntly, "Why should anyone believe G anymore?" The room went silent. Immelt swallowed hard, forced a smile, and replied, "Because we're still here." But even he didn't fully believe it. While Immelt battled fires inside, Wall Street circled like wolves. G's complex structure, dozens of subsidiaries, overlapping financials, confused even seasoned analysts. "What does G actually do now?" asked one investor in frustration. Quarterly reports were no longer enough. Transparency was demanded. But clarity exposed weakness. G's industrial arm was underperforming. G Capital was hemorrhaging trust. Immelt's solution? A pivot to digital. He unveiled G Digital with fanfare, a move to make GE the Apple of industry. But it was rushed, underfunded, and misunderstood. Engineers weren't marketers. Sales teams resisted. The new CEO of GE Digital, a Silicon Valley transplant, clashed with legacy leadership. "Culture will kill this," he warned. And it did. Within months, the digital push turned into another bullet point in investor decks. It was a vision without roots. And the roots of GE, stubborn, proud, and aging, refused to grow new branches. Outside the headlines, GE employees were losing faith. In upstate New York, a turbine manufacturing plant faced another round of layoffs. Maria Lopez, 52, had worked there since she was 18. Her father before her. "It's all just numbers to them," she said, folding her apron. Each pink slip wasn't just a name on a list. It was a family losing stability. Jay's once proud workforce felt abandoned. Cafeterias fell quiet. Retirees avoided the gates. The plant manager stopped giving speeches. Morale hit the floor. We used to make history here, one welder muttered. Now, it was just about survival. The GE logo still glowed outside the factory, but inside something essential had dimmed. These weren't just workers, they were the soul of the company. And no strategy, no restructuring, no digital transformation could replace what was being lost: belief. Back in Boston, Immelt reviewed a revised investor deck. The numbers were smoothed, the language polished, but the truth sat ugly between the lines. "Make it compelling," an advisor said. "Make it real," Immelt replied. But even he couldn't thread that needle anymore. That night he stood alone in GS Auditorium before a giant screen playing archival footage: Edison's light bulb, W2H set in engines, the moon landing, all bearing the GE stamp. The echoes of innovation filled the room, but it only deepened his isolation. He whispered, "What would they think of us now?" The room didn't answer, but the answer was clear. They'd see a company that stopped listening, that mistook prestige for progress, that forgot its people in pursuit of its stock price. It was not one of failure. It was one of forgetting how it got great in the first place. Weeks later, the Wall Street Journal published a blistering exposé. "The house that Jack built is crumbling." The article dissected Immelt's missteps, mocked GE Digital, exposed accounting tricks. The press had turned, and so did the markets. GE stock plunged again. Whoa! Shareholders erupted. Lawsuits loomed. Immelt's phone rang non-stop. Journalists, lawyers, directors. "You need to go," one board member finally said. But Immelt refused. Not yet. Not like this. He summoned his closest advisors for a midnight meeting. "I want one more shot," he said. "One clear plan. One last stand." But as he looked around the room, he saw doubt in their eyes. Even his inner circle was breaking. The next morning, news leaked of internal turmoil. CNBC called it a slow-motion collapse. Immelt, dressed in silence, tied his tie carefully and muttered, "Then let them watch." The storm broke quietly, not with thunder, but with a whisper. A whistleblower from within Jay's finance department submitted a confidential report to the SEC. The contents were explosive. Aggressive accounting, deferred losses, masked liabilities. A practice that dated back years. "This isn't just poor leadership," the whistleblower wrote. "This is deception." Within days, federal agents launched a quiet probe. Then came the leak. The New York Times splashed the story across its front page. Gage's shadow accounting revealed. Panic swept through financial circles. Immelt's team scrambled. "We've complied with everything," the legal chief said. "Not everything," Immelt replied grimly. At headquarters, nervous glances replaced greetings. Employees didn't ask questions, they already knew. The trust had been broken from the inside. He wasn't just struggling. It was now under suspicion. And suspicion has a weight no stock price can carry. The moment had come. The reckoning wasn't near, it was here. The boardroom became a bunker. Immelt sat across from external auditors, their faces unreadable. "There were discrepancies," one said, sliding a folder across the table. "Charts, footnotes, emails." Immelt scanned the pages in silence. "We trusted internal controls," he murmured. "You trusted illusions," the lawyer replied. At that moment he understood. GE's fall wasn't a result of one decision. It was death by 1,000 rationalizations. A culture where short-term wins masked long-term decay. The board demanded answers. Immelt offered none. Not yet. His voice was gone, replaced with silence. The CFO resigned the next day. The general counsel followed. Within the week, Jay's stock reached a 9-year low. Immelt watched in slow motion as the company's heartbeat faded on the monitor of public trust. He whispered to himself, this wasn't how it was supposed to end. But endings don't ask permission. In an emergency press briefing, Immelt faced the cameras one last time. A white backdrop. A trembling podium. He adjusted his notes, then looked up, not at reporters, but at the truth. We failed our shareholders. We failed our employees. We lost sight of what we were. The room fell silent. One flashbulb popped. A journalist raised her hand. Do you accept responsibility? He paused. Yes, he said softly. I own this. The headlines the next day were brutal. GGEO admits failure. Immelt accepts blame. But inside that moment was something else. A fracture of humanity. For the first time, the mask had cracked. There was no PR polish. Just a man, beaten, tired, and honest. But honesty, once delayed, rarely redeems. And for GE, the confession arrived too late. The world wasn't waiting for apologies anymore. It was waiting for blood. In a locked conference room on the 40th floor, succession talks began. Not about if, but when. Immelt's allies had gone silent. His enemies had sharpened knives. Names were floated. Resumes exchanged. Headhunters called. Among them was John Flannery, a quiet operator known for turnarounds and cost-cutting. We need a butcher, not a builder, one director whispered. The decision was made behind closed doors, absent fanfare. Flannery would take the reins. Immelt was told bluntly, you'll resign by quarter's end. He nodded, slow and defeated. Don't make it messy, they warned. It's already messy, he replied. That evening, he cleaned out his desk. No speech. No final toast. Just a man packing history into a box. One photo, one pen, one broken empire. It wasn't the legacy he imagined. But it was the one he had written, line by painful line. On his final day, Immelt walked the GE campus alone. Past the lab where ideas once soared. Past the cafe where engineers used to dream. Past the parking lot filled with empty spaces. He stopped before the massive GE logo, once a beacon, now just metal. He reached out and touched it gently. We were supposed to light the world, he said. His voice cracked. It wasn't just the end of a job. It was the end of a myth. Jack Welch's empire had collapsed under the weight of its own legacy. GE wasn't just broken. It had lost its compass. And Immelt, for all his flaws, for all his failures, had carried that burden farther than most men could. But even titans have limits. And GE's story, once filled with innovation and pride, was now a cautionary tale. A silent monument to what happens when growth becomes gospel. And no one dares to speak the truth. John Flannery took the helm quietly, without fanfare or fireworks. There were no town halls, no motivational speeches. Just an internal memo. We're entering a period of hard choices. Inside the GE towers, whispers turned to resignation. Flannery's style was surgical, precise, cold, and unsentimental. The first move, a full audit. No assumptions, no sacred cows. Within weeks, he uncovered what many feared. GE's cash flow was weaker than reported, its liabilities deeper than disclosed, and its legacy businesses bleeding faster than public numbers suggested. This is worse than we thought, he told the board. He slashed the dividend. Investors panicked. Employees cried. It's just a number, he told them. But it was our safety net, one pensioner whispered. Flannery didn't blink. He was there to stop the bleeding, not soften the blow. For the first time, J. Smith was stripped away. All that remained was debt, confusion, and the desperate need to survive. Flannery didn't stop with dividends. He moved to dismantle the very structure of GE. The conglomerate model, once its pride, was now its poison. Power, healthcare, aviation, all under review. We're breaking it up, he said flatly in a closed-door meeting. For decades, GE stood as a symbol of unity, of synergy. But synergy was dead. In its place came buzzwords: focus, transparency, shareholder value. Inside the halls, the mood darkened. Leaders of once powerful divisions received pink slips. Iconic business units, once protected like family, were now auction items. "They're selling our identity," murmured one VP. Flannery was unmoved. He saw what they couldn't. The ship couldn't be patched. It needed to be rebuilt, piece by piece. But as he tore apart the company, he also tore through its soul. There was no celebration, no resistance, just a quiet collapse, not of a company, but of a dream. Wall Street responded with confusion, then disdain. "Is there even a company left?" one CNBC anchor mocked live. G stock tumbled again. Headlines screamed, "GE, death by restructuring." Flannery stayed the course. He didn't flinch. But time was not on his side. Activist investors moved in. Trian Partners, BlackRock, power players who didn't want reform, they wanted results. "You've had your chance," one investor said in a meeting. "Now we want speed." The board grew restless. Despite his precision, Flannery lacked charisma. The market wanted a showman, not a surgeon. Rumors of his ousting began to surface just 12 months after his appointment. The irony was brutal. A man brought in to clean up a mess was now being discarded before the cleanup could begin. GE, once known for creating leaders, was now burning through them. Legacy was no longer an asset. It was a liability. On a rainy September morning, John Flannery received the call. The board had voted. He was out. No press conference. No goodbye. Just a single sentence in a filing. "John Flannery has been replaced." Larry Culp, an outsider, was named CEO. The first in GE's 126-year history. That silence was its own headline. Jay's own bloodline had failed. The empire would now be saved, if at all, by someone not raised in its halls. Flannery packed his office methodically. No emotion. No bitterness. "We waited too long," he said softly. And that truth cut deeper than any firing. Because he hadn't failed. He'd arrived too late. The storm had already devoured the structure. All he could do was record the damage. Outside, the rain fell heavier. The lobby was empty. One security guard nodded. No words. Only an unspoken understanding. GE was no longer GE. And the men once entrusted to save it were now walking ghosts. The world barely noticed. Another CEO. Another restructuring. Another day. But inside the halls of GE, a silence settled like dust. The titan that lit the world, powered nations and pioneered industries now existed in fragments. Pieces of an empire traded on Wall Street like scrap. Cotton. There were no parades, no tributes, no final chapter penned in glory. Just headlines, spreadsheets, and lawyers. In a small town in Ohio, a GE plant turned off its lights for the last time. A retired engineer stood by the gate, watching. "We built everything," he whispered. "And we forgot what we were building it for." The light bulb had dimmed. Not from failure, but from forgetting why it was lit in the first place. The climax wasn't loud. It was slow, cruel, and quiet. Not with a bang, but with a question. What do you do when giants fall, and the world doesn't even flinch? Larry Culp stepped into a role many believed was cursed. A Harvard-trained outsider known for salvaging sinking ships, he faced the wreckage of GE with clear eyes and steel nerves. "We go back to basics," he said. "No slogans. No theatrics. Just repair." His team dismantled what remained, sold off assets, slashed debt, gutted bureaucracy. Power was no longer sacred. Appliances, gone. Lighting, gone. What once defined GE was now a spreadsheet line item. The strategy was simple: shrink to survive. Culp knew it wouldn't be popular. "This isn't resurrection," he told reporters. "It's triage." Analysts applauded cautiously. Employees braced for more cuts. Inside GE, pride had withered. But Culp wasn't there to inspire, he was there to stabilize. And stability, after so much chaos, felt almost revolutionary. He wasn't a myth builder. He was a mechanic. And in GE's darkest chapter, maybe that's all it needed, someone to keep the engine running. In a quiet investor call, Culp made an announcement that would echo for decades. GE would split into 3 companies: aviation, healthcare, and energy. A final dismantling. "We believe each will be stronger apart," he said. For some it was liberation. For others, surrender. The end of the world's most iconic conglomerate. "This is history," one analyst whispered. Yet there were no tears, no protests. The fatigue had settled in too deep. For GE employees, it felt like closing a book they'd stopped reading years ago. But for Culp, it was logic. "GE doesn't need to be a monument," he told a reporter. "It just needs to work." And in that brutal simplicity was something honest. The myth was gone. But maybe the machine could still function. Leaner, cleaner, realistic. There was no more pretending. Only pieces. Pieces that might survive if they stopped trying to be whole. Former employees watched the news with quiet resignation. Maria Lopez, now retired, sat in her modest living room, GE memorabilia boxed in a closet. She stared at the screen, unreadable. "They broke it up," her son said. She nodded, then whispered, "It was already broken." For decades, GE meant stability, innovation, pride. Her hands remembered the rhythm of turbines, the noise of creation. Now those sounds were memories. She stood, walked to the closet, opened the box. A badge. A uniform patch. A photo from the plant's opening day. Tears welled, but didn't fall. She wasn't angry. She was tired. The company hadn't betrayed her. It had simply outlived itself. Not every legacy ends in applause. Some end in echoes. Some in silence. GE wasn't hers anymore. But a part of her, and millions like her, would always belong to GE. Even if GE no longer knew what that meant. The GE headquarters in Boston sat eerily quiet. Once buzzing with ambition, now reduced to low hums and flickering hallway lights. What? The logo still glowed at the entrance, polished, untouched. But it no longer inspired awe. Just memory. The halls echoed with footsteps of a company that had grown too large to notice it was falling. At a nearby museum, a small display case held Thomas Edison's light bulb next to a plaque, invented under GE's forebear. A group of students passed by, barely noticing. Legacy is fragile. Pension is fleeting. Outside, a young couple took a selfie in front of the GE sign, not out of reverence, but curiosity. "Is this place still open?" one asked. The building still stood. But the myth was gone. GE would continue, in some form. But the idea of GE, the giant, the symbol, the torchbearer, had flickered out. In the end, GE didn't explode. It evaporated. Slowly. Piece by piece. Die. The story of a titan wasn't about a single downfall, but 1,000 quiet missteps. From Jack Welch's inflated legacy to Immelt's tortured tenure, from Flannery's desperation to Culp's cleanup, each man inherited a machine no longer built for its time. They fought gravity. And gravity won. GE will live on, in aviation, in hospitals, in grid systems. But the name will no longer tower over everything. The letters will fade from buildings, from business cards, from memory. What remains is the lesson. No company, no matter how large, is too great to listen, too iconic to fail, or too complex to change. Somewhere, in a dusty garage or glowing startup, another future is being built. And maybe they'll remember GE, not for how high it rose, but for how far it fell without ever realizing it was falling. A documentary team visited GE's original facility in Schenectady, New York. The plant was partially shuttered, but remnants of greatness remained. Rusted signage, empty corridors, A wall of black and white photographs, engineers in coveralls, inventors with oil streaked hands. The camera panned slowly, landing on one image. Thomas Edison flanked by the pioneers who once changed the world. They imagined a future, the narrator said, and built it with their hands. But futures need stewards. And somewhere along the line, stewardship gave way to strategy. In the silence of that factory, surrounded by shadows of what had been, the story of GE was no longer a celebration. It was a warning. Empires don't die from fire, they rot from within. A janitor passed by with a slow push of his mop, pausing to glance at Edison's photo. He shook his head and said quietly, "We used to dream here." And then he kept moving. Larry Culp sat in his office, reviewing the final split documentation. 3 entities. 3 futures. 1 ghost. On his desk was a brass desk ornament, a mini G turbine blade. A relic. He spun it absently. Around him, the walls were bare. No portraits. No mission statements. Just silence. "This is what's left," he murmured. Function over form. Outside his window, the skyline buzzed with new companies, new titans, new myths being born. But he knew better now. Empires aren't made from headlines. They're made from humility, resilience, and the rare willingness to listen. He closed the file and stood, gazing at the GE logo one last time before it was removed. There were no tears. Only acceptance. His role was done. What came next wasn't his to shape. The age of conglomerates was over. The world had moved on. And so would GE, not as a titan, but as fragments of former glory. At a high school history class in Boston, a young student asked, "What was GE?" The teacher paused, then pulled up a faded clip, a GE advertisement from the 1950s. A man in a lab coat. A woman in a smart dress. A promise of electricity, aviation, and medicine, all from one company. The students watched with mild curiosity. "That was real?" one asked. "It was," the teacher said. "It was everything. But now, it was just a chapter. A case study. A moment." Outside the classroom, the world thrived, leaner, faster, more fragmented. But something lingered. Not the company itself, but the echo of its ambition. The dream of building things that matter. The idea that scale and soul could coexist. GE had forgotten the soul. And the world had noticed. "What happened to them?" another student asked. "They forgot what they were," the teacher replied. And no one reminded them. Back in Schenectady, the Edison light bulb still glowed in its museum case. A silent flicker against a world now drowning in leads and ives. A father and daughter stood before it. She was 10, wide-eyed. "Did he really invent light?" she asked. The father smiled. "He helped the world see." The girl pressed her nose to the glass, entranced. Around them, no crowds. No ceremony. Just a small museum in a forgotten town. And yet, in that quiet glow, history still pulsed. Because GE was never just a corporation. It was a container for human ambition, flawed, grand, relentless. The bulb flickered once more, stubborn in its glow. The girl whispered, "I want to make something like that." And in that moment, the legacy sparked again. Not in the boardroom, not on the stock ticker, but in imagination, where all empires and all rebirths begin. The screen fades to black. A single sentence appears. "Once we lit the world." No music, no movement, just silence. And then faintly, the sound of electricity humming. Not loud, just a whisper. A reminder. The story of GE doesn't end in boardrooms or bankruptcy court. It ends, and perhaps begins again, in the hearts of those who still believe that innovation means responsibility. That size isn't power. Vision is. That profit without purpose is just noise. In the quiet after the storm, one truth remains: greatness is not inherited, it is earned, moment by moment, decision by decision, light by light. As the hum fades, a final image appears. A child's hand flipping a light switch. The bulb glows. Not for profit. Not for pride. But because something, somewhere still works. And perhaps, that's enough.